Welcome to the next event of the Volt discussion series Shorts under the theme of opportunities to improve the post-COVID-19 world. Today, Julia Bader from the University of Amsterdam has kindly accepted to join us for an interview on the future of Europe-China relations. She is an associate professor at the Department of Political Science, and her research focuses on authoritarianism, on China's foreign relations, and on the external dimensions of China's authoritarianism.
Thank you for having me.
So my first question is regarding Europe's and China's economic ties, because in large parts of Africa, we can already witness how China's economic investment leads to increasing political influence, which is sometimes even referred to as neo-colonialism. And as China's investment, especially in Eastern Europe, is expanding as well, and for example, the Chinese company Huawei is being considered for building the 5G network in Europe, do you think the closer economic ties will have an impact on Europe's political sphere?
I think many observers would actually argue that this political impact is already there. And one recent example is the prevention of a common united position of the EU in the United Nations Human Rights Council on human rights violations of China, which was prevented by the Greek government. And so we already can see that sometimes individual governments tend to have different positions and make it very hard for the EU to come up with a united position on matters that concern China. But in the past, I think the fault lines within the EU were more between those countries that traded a lot with China and had a lot of exports to China, while now these investments that you mentioned play a bigger role. What Huawei will change to that debate, I'm not so sure, but my hunch is that the investments Huawei makes to Europe are different in kind from other investments, because our industries and our societies, critical infrastructure in our societies increasingly rely on digitalization and on digital networks. And if you have a leverage over that, you may even have more influence and more leverage to pressure someone to do something that they would otherwise not have done. And so that specifically the introduction or the inclusion of Huawei into these networks may be a problem. I'm not an expert to judge to what extent, because the EU has now decided to exclude Huawei from crucial parts of that network, and to what extent that is technically possible is something that I personally cannot judge. But I definitely think that the more Huawei will be included in these critical technologies and in networks, and it already is there, that will increase Chinese influence in Europe.
Okay, thank you. Now, moving on a bit to the question of authoritarianism and democracy. We often read in the news about China's influence in the world, but as the economic relations between the EU and China are being drawn closer together from both sides, can we also witness influence from Europe on China? And additionally to that, from a Western perspective, the Chinese regime is often regarded as quite stable. But you mentioned in a podcast that from a Chinese view, that is not necessarily the case. So could Europe possibly also promote democracy in China?
Yes, I think that was the hope for much of the 2000s. But I think we have passed that stage where the West could have had an influence on the domestic politics in China. And I also think we have passed the stage where that was the dominant thinking in Western capitals, that by integrating China and by engaging China, we will have that influence. So yeah, throughout most of the 2000s, the idea was that by socializing China into the international, already existing liberal international order, by engaging China, by creating mutually interdependent trade relations, we would have leverage to also change China and to support democratization and maybe even trigger democratization in China, and at least to socialize it into liberal democratic values. But I think this perspective has changed a lot. So it was only partly successful. And Chinese leaders have made crystal clear that political reforms are not on the agenda, but certainly under President Xi Jinping, the domestic situation in China has become increasingly repressive and with even less space for political opposition or dissenting voices. So I think in many Western think tanks and Western capitals now, we acknowledge that changing China, socializing China is wishful thinking. But I would also like to say that I think the initial assumption, starting assumption that we have, a symmetric relationship is maybe erroneous or faulty to some degree, and we increasingly realize that this relationship is not so symmetric than we initially thought, and maybe not so balanced as we thought, and that we quite overestimated our own weight. And so from the Western perspective, if you want to pressure someone, for example, on domestic human rights violations, you need to also sacrifice something. But Western companies are usually keen to invest in China and to extend to the Chinese market, or Western countries nowadays want to attract Chinese investment. So it can be politically really difficult for politicians or governments to decide to sanction China for domestic human rights violations with economic tools, with economic means. It is basically also punishing your own economy and your own enterprises. But it's not only that, it's even worse, because for the Chinese side, it looks much different. The Chinese side has very different leverage over their economy. So the Chinese government can incentivize and direct much better the economy, but also individual enterprises. And so for them, it's much easier to use economic tools in their diplomacy. And actually, that's also what we see. So we see, we call it economic statecraft in China's diplomacy all over the place. And economic statecraft simply means to use economic means to achieve diplomatic goals. So examples would be when the Norwegian Nobel Peace Prize was given to Liu Xiaobo, then Norway was punished by a freeze of political relations and of economic relations. Another more recent example even is when Australia asked for an investigation into the origins of the SARS-2 virus. It was threatened by economic sanctions immediately from China. And there's even statistical evidence. You can even statistically show that trade goes down for a couple of years when a statesman in the capacity of its state function meets up with the Dalai Lama. So China is using that tool, and that makes it very difficult for Western countries, particularly when they compete over these economic relations and market access to China, to at the same time use economic tools to sanction China, right? And so I would not only say it's hard to use or to anticipate these economic interdependence and economic relations to have an influence on China. Could be even the case that the more you trade with China, the more you are silenced on issues that are of importance to Chinese leadership, such as human rights violations.
Okay, thanks a lot. Now you've already sort of refer to the symmetric or rather asymmetric relationship between China and the EU. And in a report, the EU Commission called China last year a systemic rival, which has quite a negative connotation to it. So do you think this sort of negative view changed with the COVID-19 crisis, where, for example, the US under the Trump administration appears to be an increasingly less stable ally?
So, I have no special relationship with the EU Commission, so I don't know how the COVID has changed the thinking about China. But I don't think that the COVID pandemic will change the European perspective on China. And no matter what the US does. So it's crystal clear that the US is really painfully failing in leadership here. So in the last edition of The Economist, the Economist wrote this COVID pandemic is a telling case study to investigate the relationship or the rivalry between the US and China in terms of world leadership. And I think that is a fitting description, except for, I would add, I don't think it's a particularly successful case for China. And so this unwillingness or an inability of the US to take on leadership, it's a problem for Europe, but it's something that precedes the pandemic. And so in the past, we had several cases where the Chinese position and the Chinese ambition to actually do something constructive in world leadership was much more sensible for the Europeans, and where they would actually ally with China. So think of the Paris Climate Agreement, where Xi Jinping decided to stick to the agreement even when President Trump decided to withdraw. Then another example would be the establishment of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. That was an initiative by China, partly driven by the inability of the US to reform the existing Bretton Woods system, so the World Bank and the IMF. And in the end, almost the whole of Europe joined in this initiative against the will of the US. And I think in these cases, for European leaders, they would take sides with China because it makes sense and because they considered that these initiatives as constructive. And so China has profited in terms of international reputation from the withdrawing of or backtracking of US leadership. But in the specific case of the pandemic, I think it's hard for me to believe that the Europeans will eventually side with China, even if the US is failing to do anything, and even if China is now pledging more money to the WTO. And simply the reason why I think that is because A, the Chinese leadership is part of the problem in this specific case, and B, in a couple of, so you mentioned already this report with a strategic rivalry, but across the board, I think Europe has become much more critical about the role of China during the last couple of years. And so it's hard for me to believe that anyone at the EU level will buy in a Chinese narrative in this case. And so what China is now trying to do is using the pandemic to promote a positive image about China, by sending medical equipment and using that as a propaganda tool to show their willingness and their generosity, and along the way that creates nice headlines for domestic audience. If you can write, look, the world is smacking for our help and they admire our management of this crisis, and they're failing badly in the US. But at the same time, when a couple of weeks ago, the EU agency wanted to publish a report on disinformation about the pandemic, and they had to rewrite the report because of pressure of China. Then there was the case about Australia. They want to investigate the origin of the virus, and they get pressured from China. So I don't think, given this background, that anyone at the EU level will buy into this narrative of China's. And we will see what happens, but I don't think it's a good case study to say this is now Chinese leadership against American failure.
Okay. And also in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, in many European countries, the Chinese way of handling the pandemic with the use of a Corona app has recently been applied. And as a lot of this technology is imported from China, what effect will this have on sort of surveillance?
So what effect will this have on surveillance in Europe? If you want to use that tool for control and surveillance, you can do that. You can see that in other Asian countries as well, Singapore, South Korea, where it's also used to enforce quarantine rules. So it's quite intrusive. It can be quite intrusive, but I think the answer to your question is hard because there are different versions of the app. And personally, I was quite surprised to see when last week in Germany another version of this app was introduced, that even very consumer-oriented, privacy-oriented NGOs and agencies would be very positive about the app, because there was such a big discussion about it before it was even launched that it was tried to engineer the app in a way to prevent misuse and intrusion by the way it is set up. So I'm again not the expert to judge whether it's possible to make such an app, leakage proof or hacking proof. I think there's always some kind of a risk, but apparently you can design it in a way that is much less intrusive and cannot so easily be misused as the version that is used in China or in other Asian countries. But the other part of the story, of course, is always the context. So who is using it, the agents, and what is the legal context in which that is used? What are the control mechanisms that ensure that this app is not misused? And so I would, if you ask me about the surveillance or the potentials for surveillance in Europe, I would say it might lead to more surveillance and control. But I would expect that to happen in places where there are already anti-democratic players around, where there is maybe already a weakened rule of law or weakened control mechanisms, weakened independent courts that can rein in the agents who have access to data and who can use the app.
Mm-hmm. So since you're already talking about sort of weakened democracies within Europe, I was wondering, what can Europe do to protect its democracy from these authoritarian influences from China?
A lot. So I think the first thing is to understand that we all profit from a united position as Europeans. And so I think the EU needs to do everything they can to make the EU speak with one voice when it comes to issues that concern China. And so rather than allowing China to divide Europe by using short-term economic incentives, the EU needs to make sure that this long-term interest in keeping up liberal democratic values is really in our own interest. And so that may imply that we need to continue to redistribute at the EU level to disincentivize weaker EU members to play the China card. And then, of course, in addition, we need to strengthen our democratic institutions, the institutions at the core, like the parliaments, parties, independent courts. And how can we strengthen them? I think transparency is a key word here. We need to make sure that it's very transparent how decisions are taken and why they are taken, and make sure that it's also transparent who gives money for what. So I'm now talking about lobbyism, but it turns out that China is also great in lobbying. And so we can, for example, take a very concrete example how other countries that are even more in the influence sphere of China than we are, how they try to tackle this challenge. And for example, again, in Australia, if you look at Australia, they have recently introduced a law that obliges political figures to be transparent on where they receive money from, for which agents they speak, and particularly if these are external, foreign agents, and not only governments, but also government-related individuals or government-related companies. And I think that extends to, you know, how parties are financed. We want to know from whom parties receive money. And there's, I think, a lot of things you could still improve at the EU level, but also in individual countries. Another thing that I think is very important is when I speak about strengthening democratic institutions is the more peripheral institutions that are still necessary and crucial for functioning democracy, such as an independent news, independent research, to ensure, you know, an open but well-informed debate. And we all need, you know, quality newspapers, qualitatively high qualitative investigative journalism, independent knowledge creation, independent research to understand what China wants, what China is doing, and to understand China itself. So we also need to make sure that these institutions actually are independent, and to safeguard these institutions from money that comes, for example, from China. And that can also, you know, that can mean you need to fund these institutions better. And we tend to think of a newspaper that has a sound business model as being an independent newspaper, but I think economic influence can also quickly translate into political influence. And so, or give incentives to say certain things and don't say other things. So I think we need to reconsider that. But the same holds also for universities, for example. I see that from my own, you know, profession. There needs to be rules how we deal with grants from China. And that's shouldn't be the individual researcher's task to figure it out. It should be transparent. So that's another area where we need or we can reinforce our democratic values. And then there's also another interesting example to look at, Taiwan, where they have found quite some creative solutions to tackle disinformation in social media, because they are also in the front line of disinformation coming from China, and where they have also stepped up, you know, how they communicate with their citizens and how they treat fake news on social media in a very humorous way. And so all these things, I think, are very, very important to safeguard our democracies.
Okay, great. So then this probably already, you mentioned probably already a few aspects for my final question, which is, if you had the power to change something in Europe after COVID-19, what would that be?
So I think this pandemic really uncovers or unravels all, you know, the conditions that are inhumane in our societies, and that's the social inequality, and where we can see how people who have less access or less paid job, maybe not so well educated people, but that immediately translates into not so good healthcare and higher, you know, death tolls among these people often. Same time, we can see how, whether it's in Singapore or in this slaughterhouse in Germany or elsewhere in Europe, how weak labor are still exploited. So I think there's a lot of things to do when it comes to social inequality, social justice, that we should, you know, improve on. And again, I think communication and the way we engage in debates and the way we engage in information and information, discussion about information needs to be something that we need to really take to the heart, because it's something that is very crucial for our societies, but it can see time and again that it's polarizing and very, you know, poisoning for our societies. So I think we need to think about clever ways to deal with polarization that is based on also fake news and misinformation.
Okay, so thank you very much on the behalf of Volt for joining us today and for elaborating on this complex issue. And you're also warmly invited to watch our upcoming event on tax evasions in the Netherlands.
Oh, interesting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.